So we're very happy to have her here again. The books that we have featured are Elaine Pagels' The Origin of Satan, which she'll be discussing in her presentation, and then also Why Religion, a personal story. Very interesting, her story. And if you haven't had a chance to follow her own personal story, this is a great introduction to it. And to her issue of why religion, why does religion survive? I also want to point out that in honor of Sylvia Kaufman's many years of support, the Kaufman Institute commissioned this book called Sylvia's Story, a woman's lifetime journey to interfaith understanding. And so if you don't have a copy of this, they are for sale for $5 at the book stand. So anyway, it's a great pleasure to have Elaine Pagels back again. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, as I said, even though this part of the story isn't an easy one. This part started more than 2,000 years ago, and I think the most important question is one people often don't ask, which is, was Jesus of Nazareth a real person or was he a fictional one? And I'm convinced that he was an actual person because we know that not only his followers, but also people who detested him wrote about him. In fact, the most certain, this is written by G.C.S. Brandon, a military historian from Britain, who wrote a book called Jesus and the Zealots. He says, the most certain thing we know about Jesus of Nazareth is that he was crucified with Roman governor Pilate. And this is the sign over the cross, as they said, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, are written in 3 languages. We know this is the only fact about Jesus, by the way, that all of his followers and devotees agreed about. And all of the people, so far as we know them, who detested him also agreed. Tacitus, the Roman senator, says, Nero fastened the guilt for something, inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the people. He says, Christus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of our procurator Pontius Pilate, and a most unfortunate superstition broke out not only in Judea, the source of the evil, but also in Rome, where everything evil from all over the world can become popular. That's Tacitus. But he had no doubt that Jesus was a real person because he had a death date and he had evidence. Josephus, who wrote, of course, the Jewish War and was in the Jewish War, says, about this time there was Jesus, who drew over to him many of the Jews and many Gentiles. Pilate, at the suggestion of principal men among us, condemned him to the cross. But the tribe of Christians named for him are not extinct even now in the 1st century. Suetonius, a Roman court historian, says, yes, he talked about the Christians named for Christ. He says, a class of people infected by a new and evil superstition. So, yes, this is something they knew about Jesus of Nazareth. Now, we also know that he was among thousands of Jews living in Judea at the time, whom Roman soldiers had crucified on the same charge, that is, encouraging revolution in the name of God and our common liberty. It always sounds to me something like the American Revolution, trying to free this country or part of it from domination by Britain, trying to free Judea from the dreadful domination of Rome. And after he died, one of his followers wrote, nearly everybody left the movement. I mean, he was a failure, right? And the saying was, we thought he was the one to deliver Israel. And of course, parenthesis, but of course we were wrong. But as you know, some of his dogged followers didn't give up. And some of them soon afterwards started to say things like this. He's not dead. He's alive. I've seen him. He's coming back to rule the world in the age to come. It sounds like a bizarre phenomenon that after he died, this happened. we have a contemporary parallel, but we'll talk about that later maybe. But anyway, a majority in the Jewish community regarded his followers as followers of a false Messiah, a rabbi who either was a fool, as they said, or a fraud. And we know that after his death and at the time, throughout the first century of what we call the Common Era, CE, the Roman rulers were very wary of Jews starting revolution, militant, devout Jews trying to free their country from Rome. And so the Roman rulers clamped down harder than ever. And so after Jesus died, it was in the reign of Tiberius, about the first third of the Common Era, the Romans who ruled Judea assumed that if you were a follower of somebody convicted of sedition against Rome, you're one of them, right? It's like saying someone's a follower of bin Laden. They may deny that they're part of the same plot, but courts would assume otherwise. So in the years after that, Jesus' relatives were arrested, some in Jerusalem, and accused of sedition. And after that, all of the most prominent leaders we know of were killed violently. Jesus' brother, James, he had an actual brother, and several others, Mark says, became the leader of a group of his followers in Jerusalem, and he was stoned to death in 62 of the Common Era in Jerusalem, near the temple, they say. Paul of Tarsus, who had set out with letters from the chief priest to arrest Jesus' followers as heretics, became a convert, as you know, and after that began spreading the message of Jesus of Nazareth. He died violently, whipped and beheaded by order of a Roman magistrate, because he too was accused of sedition. And Peter, who was one of Jesus' closest followers, headed a group in Rome, was arrested and tortured and crucified as Jesus was, only they say in a worse way, as the Jewish war was raging in Judea. And before any of the writings of Jesus were written that are now in the New Testament, the Jewish war had broken out around 66, right, when the chief priests stopped making offerings on behalf of the welfare of Rome. And then 60,000 Roman soldiers, some sources say, marched into Jerusalem and starved and besieged and finally captured the holy city. You're acquainted with that, right? Now, in spite of the danger they faced, Jesus' followers, seen as seditionists, toward the end of the war, a couple literate followers started to write and circulate stories about him. They were not writing history of Jesus of Nazareth. They said they were writing good news, and they wanted, the purpose of their writings, which we now call the Gospels, was to promote the movement and encourage you to join it. So they put Jesus in the most favorable possible light. But they were very well aware that he was accused of sedition against Rome and insurrection. So they go to huge lengths to deny the obvious fact, deny that the Roman governor ever condemned Jesus or sentenced him to death. And they spun the story to suggest that Jewish leaders, jealous of him, sentenced him and engineered the crucifixion. Strange story. One that Fergus Miller, a British historian, thinks is the most likely is that, it's written in the Gospel of John, is that the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, was concerned that Jesus of Nazareth, the rural rabbi, was preaching and prophesying and healing people and stirring up massive demonstrations. And they said, if that happens during Passover, the Romans are going to come in here with military force and destroy a lot of people. So it's better that one man die than have the whole people threatened. And so the Sanhedrin, as the Gospel of John tells it, decided to have him arrested and sent to Roman Governor Pilate for trial. But an earlier version, which is in what we call the Gospel of Mark, emphasizes that from the very start of Jesus' public activity, there were members of the Jewish community from the beginning of the story were already out to kill him. That's in the very beginning of Mark's Gospel. And when he started to set up public demonstrations, apparently intending to act out in public the prophecy in Zechariah, which talks about, "Behold, Jerusalem, your king is coming to you riding on a donkey, on the foal of a donkey, and he will rule the world from, the entire world." Jesus seems to have set up a demonstration riding into Jerusalem on a donkey so that people aware of the prophecies would know that he was the one coming to rule the world and presumably throw out the Romans. And the Romans would have noticed the uproar in the city. Some people say that what triggered his arrest is that Jesus actually went into the temple itself and started a public demonstration. We don't know if that's true. Paula Fredrickson ridicules the idea, and some other scholars do. I don't know if it happened, but we do know that the chief priests apparently, the chief priests in Jerusalem had approximately, so far as I've read in Josephus, about 5,000 man military force, temple police, to keep order in Jerusalem. That was their job. And so they were trying to keep order in the city, and they sent a heavily armed posse of temple police to capture him at night. And they brought him to the chief priest's residence to bring him to Pilate in the morning. This is where the story gets strange. Mark says that on the same night, the chief priest immediately assembled a full-scale trial and used deliberately false testimony to convict Jesus of blasphemy. The question there was, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Most High God?" And according to this gospel only, Jesus says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven," quoting the prophecy of Daniel. Now, according to Mark, the chief priest tore his garment and pronounced sentence, death for blasphemy. And Mark says the whole council unanimously endorsed a death sentence for Jesus of Nazareth. Mark goes on to say that when Jesus was taken the next day to the residence of the Roman governor, the next morning for trial, the Jewish crowd outside kept interrupting and shouting repeatedly to demand crucifixion. And Pilate refused. Pilate kept saying, "Wait a minute, this man, he's innocent. What has he done wrong?" And the crowd simply shouts, "Crucify him." And Pilate says, "Wait, this man is an innocent man. He may be a rural, humble man with nothing to recommend him, but nevertheless, I don't want to execute him. I want to release him." Mark even pretends that he knows Pilate's inner thoughts. He says he knew that they turned him over because they were jealous of him. Really? And it says he's trying to release him, and the crowd keeps shouting, "Crucify him." And Pilate is trying very hard to release this poor man, but he can't do it. And he said, "Why? What has he done?" He gets no answer. And then Mark says they kept shouting, "Crucify him." And finally, Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, handed him over to be crucified. Did you know what Mark leaves out of the story? Pilate never pronounced a death sentence. That's interesting. Now, when someone else, another follower of Jesus, revises Mark about 10 years later, this is either done during the end of the Jewish War or shortly afterwards, the so-called account written by someone called Luke says Pilate refused 3 times to order the death sentence. He kept saying, "I find the man not guilty. He's done nothing. I want to release him. I find him innocent." The Jewish crowd keeps shouting loudly for crucifixion. And he says, and Luke says, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate ordered that their demand should be granted and handed him over as they wanted it. Now, what did Pilate order? He didn't order the death penalty. He just ordered, oh, let them do what they want. That's all. Luke goes very much farther than Mark. He says, even the man crucified for insurrection next to Jesus, as he's dying, turns to Jesus and says, we're getting what we deserve, but this man is not guilty. The insurrectionist himself says Jesus is not guilty. And finally, Luke pictures a Roman soldier on the execution squad who has helped kill Jesus, saying, certainly this man is innocent. So in Luke's version, all the Romans in the story say, the man is innocent. Another version, Matthew's, adds 3 new episodes. First, to satisfy the shouting mob, Pilate offers to release a prisoner whose name they say is Barabbas, a revolutionary who had killed Roman soldiers during insurrection. I'll release him or Jesus. And the crowd shouts for Barabbas. Well, what should I do with Jesus? And the crowd shouts, have him crucified, have him crucified. And after repeatedly insisting that Jesus is innocent, Pilate caves in and says, I'm innocent of this man's blood. You do it yourselves. And then he orders for a basin of water to be brought, and he washes his hands to demonstrate his innocence of the blood of Jesus. And Matthew adds this terrible saying, which, you know, his blood be upon us and on our children. Okay, that's the story. It gets worse and worse. What's wrong with the picture? Historians of the ancient world have shown that every detail in these scenes is counterfactual. First of all, the only person in Judea who could order crucifixion was Pilate, the Roman governor. He was the only person authorized to order the death penalty. Secondly, only Roman troops could carry it out. They had the manpower. They knew how to do it. They had an army. They did it all the time. And third, the charge over the cross, as they all agree, was insurrection, a penalty only reserved for the worst offenders who were either traitors to Rome, seditionists trying to fight against Roman rule. So that doesn't work. Second, the historians have said, could Pilate have ordered the release of a known insurrectionist? Ask Roman military historians. Those who have written about it say, if Pilate had done that, the Roman governor of Judea, he would have immediately been recalled to Rome and told to commit suicide. That's what, I mean, a Roman governor could not do that. It's completely counter to his obligation to keep the peace in Jerusalem by any means possible and get rid of insurrectionists. Third, who was Pilate? What do we know about Pilate? People did know. These are politically astute Jewish leaders among his contemporaries. Many of you are familiar with them. First century figures, first Philo of Alexandria, chosen by the people of Alexandria to lead a delegation to the emperor on behalf of the Jewish community in Alexandria. He was influential, educated, highly respected. He said, Pilate, oh yeah, he's famous for rigidity, stubbornness, cruelty, abusive behavior, frequent executions without trial, and endless savage ferocity. We know him. And Josephus, writing the Jewish War, and very aware of the political situation of Judea in the first century, said, this is written independently, of course. He probably didn't read what Philo wrote, had written several decades earlier. Oh, Pilate, extremely contemptuous toward us Jews, deliberately provocative. And when we demonstrated in protest against something he did, we were outside his residence protesting for 5 days one time when he did something outrageous. He brought Roman standards into the holy city that were very offensive to Jews. He sent armed soldiers into the crowd to beat and kill people as soon as they were given the signal, and the rest ran for their lives. He was absolutely ruthless with crowd demonstrations. So what the Gospels say is entirely unlikely. So they ignore his reputation for brutality. They cast him as the defender of Jesus. But who was Pilate? Now, there's an important book by Paul Winter written in 1961 called The Trial of Jesus, and he was talking about these stories in great detail, studying the ancient history. And he said, you know, if you look at the New Testament Gospels, you look at Mark, say, written in about the year 68 to 72, Luke written in the 70s or 80s, 90s, Matthew written in the 90s of the first century, the Gospel of John written maybe 10 years after that. From one to the other, to the later, to the later. He said, the further you get from history, the more mellow Pilate becomes. Finally, he starts out as a very ruthless and vicious man. He then can be played by David Bowie in a movie because he seems very thoughtful and curious and not really murderous. And he even becomes, in some Christian circles by the 4th century, a Christian saint because he's trying to defend Jesus, right? And what I realized when I read Paul Winter's book, and you can check this for yourselves if you like, it's a tough study. The nicer Pilate gets in every story, the more murderous the Jewish crowd looks. They get worse and worse and worse in each telling of the story. Another question Paul Winter raises is, did the high priest and the council sentence Jesus to death? So far as we know, the Jewish council never met at night. Especially, we don't know everything about the 1st century, but it was completely counter to their practice. And if the Sanhedrin had met and ordered the death penalty, they would have done it by stoning, which was a traditional Jewish penalty, right? They didn't know how to crucify people. They didn't have the means. Furthermore, cases involving the death penalty required a 24-hour delay, which didn't happen in this case. Furthermore, as Winter points out, declaring yourself Messiah is not blasphemy. It just means Son of God. It can mean that he was declaring himself to be the King of Israel, like King David and other kings of Israel. And even if he had committed blasphemy, as Winter says, blasphemy is not punishable by death. So how likely is that story? Furthermore, for hundreds of years after the crucifixion of Jesus, the penalty for being a follower of his was death because they were convicted of sedition for hundreds of years after Jesus was convicted of sedition by Pilate. This is a letter sent from the governor of Asia, Pliny, to Emperor Trajan, not too long after this. He said these people showed up in his court accused of being Christians, and he said, I don't really know what their crimes are, but I just decided they deserve the death penalty because of their insanity and obstinate refusal to obey my orders. So I had them whipped and beheaded. I just want to know, what do you think we should do in these cases? And Trajan says, yes, well, you did the right thing, Governor. And for 300 years after that, anyone who joined the movement was liable to be tried and tortured and killed either by a mob, which often happens, we have reports of that, or in the sports stadium by order of the governor. There are many accounts of these witnesses, as they call the martyrs, as Jewish witnesses always called themselves, And very few dared protest. So that's the story of powerlessness. Now, it changes, as you know. When the emperor, or the one aspiring to be emperor, suddenly converted and became a Christian and took Christ as his patron, Constantine, the year was what, 312? Suddenly, being a Christian, meant that you were part of the emperor's party. You were on the right side of power, because Constantine had all power in his own hands, unlike the emperors before him who had to divide it in the empire that, after all, this empire went from what is now Britain and France and Europe to Spain and Africa and to Iran. I mean, it was what the Romans called the whole world. And now Constantine ruled all of it. And he ended persecution of Jesus's followers. So in this case, power certainly transforms morality, or at least the legal versions of it. And then within decades, while converting to Christianity became a political advantage, as one writer says, Christian prejudices against the Jews became legal disabilities. We don't have to go into the details of how legal codes were changed in the 50 years after Constantine became emperor by his followers. But one of the provisions of the new law was that, well, one of them outlawed crucifixions, and another one said that anyone who converted someone to Judaism was liable to being burned alive. So we can't go through, and we don't need to, how for thousands of years in what's called the Holy Roman Empire and Christian Europe, that remained the case. So I want to stop there and go back just for a minute and say Jesus's followers didn't only associate Jews with the powers of evil. They also weaponized Satan against other targets, starting with women. One famous Christian spokesman, father of the church, one of them, wrote to women, "You are the devil's gateway." I mean, the devil couldn't attack Adam. He was too strong, but you're the weaker link, so he attacked you, and you let the devil in, and it's all your fault, and you should be punished just like Eve, humility and submission to men. This is from one of the Genesis Rabbah, which speaks to Eve. The serpent was your serpent. This is based on puns in Hebrew, and you were Adam's serpent. Anyway, that's. And then many of you know that Martin Luther wrote this famous treatise called The Jews and Their Lies, who basically said Satan's agents not only include all Jews who refuse to convert, but all peasants who rebel against the wealthy landlords, all Roman Catholics, and all Protestants who aren't Lutheran. So that's inclusive. And this kind of thing hasn't stopped. I mean, Father Junipero Serra, I grew up in California, where many of the Catholic monasteries are named for him, was canonized not long ago by the Catholic Church, even though he's accused of annihilating many of the native people. There's a lot of wrong that is done in the name of Christ, right? And some Muslims have adopted the same image and used it in reference, used it back. So I want to stop with that and just, this is a different moment in which Marc Chagall, as many of you know, challenged that whole view of Jews killing Jesus by picturing the crucified Jesus as Israel with Abraham, Sarah, and Jacob over his head, and inscriptions in Hebrew, and the terrors of Europe at the time behind him. So I don't want to stop with only the terrible parts of Christianity. This was a story I was very sad and disheartened to recognize is deeply embedded. And it's so deeply embedded in many Christian stories that people don't even know it's there. That's when I showed this work to my colleague, and she said, "But isn't Christianity all about love?" And that's when I said, "Yes, at its best, it is. But there's a current in there that nurtures hatred, and it still does." I wanted to mention, of course, Christian tradition is not univocal at all. It's a short term for 2,000 years worth of enormous number of manuscripts and liturgies and prayers and stories. I mean, a huge corpus of things, and they're very diverse. So this doesn't speak for all of it. I just wanted to remind us that there are many who saw this differently, as we heard today from a Christian member here. St. Francis of Assisi and Catholic tradition, speaking of love for all beings, including the sun, the moon, the stars, the birds. St. Mary of Paris, I don't know if you know of her, but her story is very moving. She lived in Paris in the 1940s when the Holocaust was going on. And a Russian Orthodox woman who had a soup kitchen for hungry people and collected clothes for people who were desperate in Paris at the time, and even went into a square when Jews were being rounded up to be taken off in trains to their deaths. She went into the square herself and persuaded some of the parents to let her put their children in garbage bins where they were hidden and where they survived. And they found families for these children later. Anyway, can hardly speak about that. She had also had a 6-year-old child who died, so she knew what that would mean to these parents. And she later died in Auschwitz herself, along with her son, for defying the Nazis. So I'm saying this is another side of Christianity, the side we would like to uphold, right? And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., who was talking about God's love for all people and trying to bring more justice into this country as well. So I want to stop with that. That's enough. And open it up for questions or comments.
Thank you so much. As I was listening to your presentation, what you taught me is how the search for power creates immoral stories. And what are the stories we tell? What stories do we take responsibility for? You know, it's one of where in a world where everything could be fake, what's the danger of that? We could tell any stories, and there's no correctives. So you could, the danger of stories is that it also immunizes you from criticism, because it's never something that you did. You tell a different story that serves your search for power, for dominance, for truth, or for whatever it is that for winning. And I want to think about this, just putting it out there. You know, we tell stories as if it's so easy. How dangerous these stories could be. And what does it mean? Like, I watch you. It's like I felt like I was watching a heroine, like someone of great courage, trying to take responsibility for the stories that her tradition told. And as a Jew, I'm very humbled by the courage of Christianity as a religion, or many of them. And you are a beautiful example and bear witness to a willingness to do tshuva, a willingness to say the stories I told led me in the wrong direction. And I have to retell us. What you were doing is also is telling a new story. You were telling a story of Christianity's story so that you could begin to tell a new story. And I think a lot about the stories that my tradition tells. Eventually, we also started to tell stories about Jesus, but hundreds of years, like at the time.
Yeah.
Much later, we got into the fray. But it was sort of, they were sort of pathetic because like, there was like, it was like, what were we going to do? But I very often look at contemporary Judaism and what are the stories we tell about other religions, about God, about the Temple Mount? What are the things we pray? What are the words that we use? And what are the consequences of those words? And your presentation was just a beautiful model for demanding us to take ownership of the stories we told and to start telling different stories. And for that, I am very, very much in your debt. Thank you.
Thank you. I wasn't looking for this story at all. I thought I was looking at old folk tales about Satan, and it was a kind of cathartic thing to do after I'd been dealing with some traumas. And to my surprise, those old stories led me right back into real history, and I was taken aback. And I didn't want to find this out, but the evidence is very clear. And the turning the stories to suggest that Pilate did not condemn Jesus wasn't based on hatred of other Jews, so much as it was based on a desire to survive, because their lives were in danger. They were in danger for hundreds of years. Many of followers of Jesus tortured and killed. So they were simply trying to survive.
You know, and Mark Twain would say they meant well in the worst sense of the term. Right? It's like you had good intentions, but
well, good in a sense. I mean, it was just but deflecting, and it wasn't dangerous because they were the persecuted minority. Jews were an accepted minority in the Roman Empire, apart from the war, but followers of Jesus were absolutely enemies because they were seditionists. That's how it went until they got power, and then it changed.
I love the fact that we started with Genesis and we came to Jesus of Nazareth. Like that's a dizzying, walkthrough in history, theological history. There is more to that. There is the Third Testament, which is the Quran. I'll tell you more about it too. But it's important to get these basics. And one thing you said was brilliant, Elaine. And somebody said, "But Christianity is a religion of love," and you said, "At its best, yes." Right. We've seen the worst of it too. I mean, in the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, and terrible stories. Jewish people know that very well, especially. I can say the same thing about Islam. At its best, it's a religion of mercy. At its worst, it can be a religion of violence and conquest and subjugation and religious oppression and so on and so forth. And we are seeing that as well. And of course, people love to compare their religions by looking at their best and looking at their worst, saying that obviously my religion is much nicer, but I think the reality is much more complicated. Now, you also said one more thing that, there's a strain that, in there which sometimes creates oppression or evil. I mean,
Or nurtures it.
Nurture.
Yeah.
I think us being Christians and Muslims, the monotheists who have this universalistic claim of converting everyone, right? we have this tension in our religion that we claim that there's a universal truth. This is the true God, this is the true prophet or the true Messiah, the Christ. You come to God through him. Please come to God, we want to save you, right? So that's a considerate, loving message, right? That's the truth. But what do you do with the people who deny that truth, who defame that truth, or who insert heresies into it and corrupt the truth, right? So do you attack the infidels, the blasphemers, the heretics? Well, if you say yes, a lot of evil might be coming out of that, and people burn at the stake for blasphemy, in places like Europe, which was called Christendom. In Islam too, I mean, you have, if these are the enemies of God, if these are the heretics, if these are the blasphemers, and those things are still around in the Muslim world in some pockets. So we have to deal with this. Yes, we believe in a truth, and that truth claim is not going to go away. As a Muslim, I believe Islam is the truth, which is just actually confirming the previous truths. By the way, it's not negating them. That's Judaism and Christianity. But there are resources also in our religion that, okay, we can live with you if you don't exactly believe in my truth. We can agree on a common universal value. Our religion itself gives some resources for pluralism. And so how do we cultivate that? Now, with respect, I think in Judaism, that problem is not much there. I mean, you don't want to convert everybody into Judaism, right? So that's there's no, also, I think in the history of Judaism, I don't know Sanhedrin and at the time, well, but at least of 2,000 years, there has not been a Jewish Inquisition, Jews didn't even have the resources to do that. But with respect, I can also remind my fellow friends here who are Jews, in Judaism, there's also another claim, which is you say, this is our promised land, right? You claim a land. Now, I understand that, I respect it, but there might be people who are living already there, right? So how do you deal with them? Again, you can deal with them graciously, mercifully through coexistence, through peace. Let's live together, right? Or you can think that they're a problem and you can try to get rid of them, and I think some extreme people want to do that, I think today and back in history too. So our claims to truth, our claims to our salvation, our claims to our own safety, which is very valuable and necessary, can we reconcile that with people from other faiths, from other religions, from other nations, from other tribes? And I think you can find the resources for bad ends and the good ones. And I think our job as people who believe in universal peace and coexistence, and I think freedom, should be to cultivate those trends. And then there are a lot of people working for it. And also we should see that they are working for it. It's not only, one more thing, people tend to see the bad guys on the other side more easily, right? The most disturbing voices, regarding Islam, you have, there's this website, Memory, you might know. It just highlights a lot of pretty crazy views by some radical preachers in the Muslim world. They disturb me too. I think they disturb a lot of Westerners. Or you see Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, all these terrible groups with a lot of hatred and violence. But, they're not the majority of Muslims. There are also a lot of nice, they don't make the headlines. They don't make the news. Let me tell you, the same dynamic is working on the other side as well too. When Muslims open their headlines, they see the most shocking anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic, or anti-violent words coming out of the US, Europe, or sometimes Israel these days. And they think this is who they are, you see? Well, they are much more complicated and nuanced as you are. And I think we should try to keep those bridges of understanding.
I appreciated what you said in terms of how there's elements in our stories that shape us in a variety of ways. I think that's continued. One example that has been most recent in my reading has been, as I've studied apocalyptic literature, going back to Revelation, which to me is a book of hope, and originally hope against the Roman oppression. But when we weren't bugged by the Romans so much, we began to change the interpretation. And you know that history as well as I do. And there's variety in that interpretation. Some of the sense of hope is lost in order to who is in and who is out, and how do we predict the future, and who goes to hell and who doesn't. With that happening, we are divided, and our power has certainly affected our ethics and our politics. I didn't know if you wanted to respond to that reality. This is happening right now.
I can agree. Thank you for that comment.
Dr. Pagels, so I went to Princeton Seminary, and I was told there that the Pharisees had more in common with Jesus than we sometimes give them credit for. And if that is true, I wonder why the Bible portrays the Pharisees in such a negative light.
That's a very good question. It's certainly true, right? That Pharisees, according to Luke's gospel, warn Jesus when he's in trouble with King Herod. And Paul was a Pharisee, and you know, why do they do that? I think because they have a story to tell that is trying to protect their fellow believers from being arrested and tortured and killed. And the only, I mean, how can you can't deny the fact that Jesus was crucified. So how did that happen? Well, they say, well, yes, well, the governor would have had to order it, but actually he didn't do it in this case. The only people who gave the death sentence was the chief priest and the Jewish council. Now that doesn't make sense, because they would have to go to Pilate to get that order ratified. So your question is a very good one. I do think they're trying to protect themselves, that's all. It wasn't out of total hostility toward other Jews, because they were all Jews in that early group. They were trying to survive. Yeah. Oh, and of course, the consequences of this. I mean, nobody imagined that Christians would ever have power, right? 300 years, they are totally vulnerable, right? I mean, Constantine's conversion was a total shock. The idea that they would come into power. That was completely unforeseen, yeah.
Dr. Pagels, if you would just expand a little bit more on the equivalency between the term Son of Man and Messiah, and also, while I have your attention, how did Pilate get into the creed? That's some pretty good PR.
Well, Pilate got into the creed simply as a dating. Because if you're a Roman, you say, oh, yes, my child was born in the 3rd year of Augustus' reign. I mean, that's how you use the calendar. So when they said Jesus crucified under Pontius Pilate, it doesn't say by Pontius Pilate. But crucified during the reign of Pontius Pilate is a way of giving you a specific date. And that's another evidence that everyone said there was a real person. This is not a fictional story. This has a date. Fictional people don't have real enemies. You don't have a death date for Apollo or Attis or any fictional god, right? I mean, I call them fictional gods. I hope there's no worshipers of the Greek gods here. So that's a way of just anchoring the story in history. And thanks for bringing it up. You said Son of God and Son of Man. Is that Messiah? Well, Messiah, as you know, means anointed one. And it is the name given to someone in the Hebrew Bible, as I understand it. Saul is suddenly, the Spirit comes upon him and he becomes a different man and he becomes capable of ruling Israel. That's the first story of Saul anyway. And then the Spirit of God comes on David, right? And that's anointing with the Spirit. And so Mark says in the very beginning that the Spirit of God comes on Jesus of Nazareth when he was baptized. And the Lord himself pronounced him to be his son. So, but that would mean that he would be the divinely designated ruler of Israel and perhaps of the whole world, if you're accepting the prophecies as Jesus of Nazareth quoted them all the time. Son of Man is Mark's default version because Jesus died on a cross. He was never king of Israel, let alone the whole world. So how can you claim anything? But he says to the high priest, this is all post facto, of course, yes, I am the one anointed to be God's king over the world. And you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. So he invokes Daniel's vision of, Daniel says, well, he went up, allowed to go up into the heavens, and he saw a human being presented before the Lord, and the Lord gives him power to rule the earth. But Mark is saying, well, all right, that didn't happen during his lifetime yet. but it's an eschatological moment that will happen soon. And so he uses Son of Man as the Danielic figure that Jesus, he feels, will appear again. That's the only way you can say that a crucified man can be ruler of the world. If there's some other, if he will make an appearance in another form, transcendent appearance. But thank you, those are important questions.
Thank you, each of you, for this dialogue. I think my question is over here. My question for you is historically, each of the Abrahamic traditions have at times abused power through the institutionalized oppression of marginalized people, instituting caste-like systems, colonialism, and there's a long legacy of injustices perpetuated in the name of God. And as we engage in these conversations, we're doing so in the midst of a world that is, according to Pew Research, where millions are leaving organized religion, and many are citing these abuses as part of it. We have in the United States in the last number of years dealt with abuses of power from Hollywood to Wall Street, Me Too, Black Lives Matter. And we know that abuses of power only perpetuate more abuse. So what is the path forward for specifically each of these religions and the legacy we leave the world in terms of why we should trust more power being placed into the hands of people in religion who have historically done a very poor job at managing that power, where it doesn't reflect the compassion and justice that each of these religious traditions point to as the core pieces of the story. And yet what we've seen on the stage of history hasn't lined up with that.
Well, I don't know who would advocate giving more power to these traditions. I think you've raised a question that we hope to get to today as we think about, I think many people leave these established traditions because they just don't speak to them. They're old news. Especially Christianity has been turned into a set of dogmas in the 4th century, a set of doctrines. And I think that's very unfortunate. People are looking for something more experiential and more powerful than that, and more meaningful. Thanks for your comment.
Any others? We're all done?
Can I add one thing to that question? Oh, there's a question already. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
the Jews went from an accepted minority in the Roman Empire to an unaccepted one after the Christian era began, after Constantine's conversion. Would you comment about the quality of persecution of Jews in the European society during the time from Constantine, let's say, until the Second World War? What made the Jews able to live and make money? Was it usury rules? What was the history of the persecution and the prejudice in that time, let's say from Constantine to Hitler?
Well, you're asking about 2,000 years. And I do history that goes up through about the 4th century. It's not that they were an unacceptable minority after Christians came into power, but they were placed under special restrictions, especially, and very harmful ones after Christians came to power. They were still part of the empire. But we have a colleague from Calvin College right now who studies medieval Christianity who can maybe comment on that.
Well, come to class. I teach about this.
Yeah, this is a very big sweep of history that you were asking about. And Elaine, you're right in saying that Jews were granted a particular status when Christianity became the majority and had power. And you had Christian kingdoms, Christian empires. The big question was, what do you do with religious minorities? And the Jews were the most prominent, most vocal, I think, also minority. And there's this ambivalence in Christian history. On the one hand, we love Jews because that's where we come from. It's the old Israel. We are the new Israel. We love their Bible. That's our Bible too. So there is a lot of appreciation. Augustine is the one who is embodying that appreciation. Says, you should not persecute Jews. They are a witness to Christian truth. Maybe they don't have the truth themselves, but they're witnessing to our truth. On the other hand, there's a tradition that you talked about that demonizes the Jews as the killers of Jesus. These always have been in tension with each other, and sometimes, regrettably, the latter won out from the former attitude.
Thank you. I mean, when I started this, I was quite stunned and distressed by what I found. And I wanted to go up 2,000 years and look at what happened, what the laws were in the Holy Roman Empire, so-called, and Christian Europe. I couldn't do it because I'm a historian, and I'm not competent to do it. Jim Carroll picked it up in his book, Constantine's Sword, from my book, and he tried to do 2,000 years. And because he's a journalist and not a historian, he could do it with a lighter touch, and not feel that he has to nail down all the details. So his book is much more comprehensive. But there's a lot of history there to be told.
One of the things that we Jews have learned is that 2,000 years, stories have been told about us. Now, you started to tell the first story and why it started. But one of the stories in these 2,000, or one of the features that seems to be consistent, is that anti-Semitism takes the form of identifying the Jew as the personification of the evil du jour. I'll say, who is the Jew? They are the personification of the evil du jour. So pick whether it was the Christ killer or it was user, whatever it might be, of treacherous, like if there was some value that you were trying to advocate for, Jews personified it. We didn't just fail like other people. We were the model of that. And so every century and every society told these stories about us. And one of the interesting things about stories, as distinct from law, is that law could get changed. Stories, they enter into your culture. They become self-evident. Part of the challenge that we face today is that, again, you already sense that I'm very critical of my tradition when it needs to be criticized, and critical of Israel when it needs to be criticized. But part of what's happening is that we are now the colonialists, the personification of all the abuses of white power colonialism. It's like, it's not a universal problem. It's like, we are the. And so if you are upset by the evil of colonialism, Israel that's why. See, you could criticize Israel. You could be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. All of that is possible. Some of my, I'm criticizing, but it's when it's like you become the personification, the worst example of it. That's when Jews begin to feel that some of the discourse begins to be anti-Semitic, because we're used to this 2,000-year-old story where, what are the stories you tell about us? And that whole relationship, and that's why your presentation, I believe, is so important, because it looks at stories, and stories are really, and you said, the stories we tell, Mustafa, about each other, there's no counterfactuals. There's no, especially today, you can't dispute any. It's like it becomes a reality, and our news sites reaffirm these stories and everything that we tell about them. So all of that is an important background, I think, to much of what we're talking about.
Religions come from stories, or stories develop religions. And the religions cause so much antagonism, cause so much wars. I wonder what our world and our people and humanity would be without any religions. Wouldn't that be quite ideal?
You have to ask John Lennon. But I think part of the 20th century has enabled us to be less guilty about being religious, because it seems that people find adequate replacements to be their new gods. And it could be a state, it could be nationalism, we find replacements. Count on these human beings. We're quite ingenious. So if you take away from us religion, we'll find new vehicles for our evil inclinations. Don't worry.
But if religions are as cultural systems, as anthropologist Clifford Geertz says, we can't be without them. These transmit the values of particular cultures, and when they clash, this is what sometimes happens.
I love the statement of Rabbi Hartman that the hatred of being powerless versus being powerful, and if you have to choose, you choose being the power, having power. And then the transition into the effect of people who are powerless, mistelling stories that actually have a
dire effect on our history and our relationships between our religions. Today, there are stories being told about the powerlessness or the assumed powerlessness of Christians in America. Is that same fear what is driving this grasp for power? Are there any truths to the fact, are Christians becoming powerless in America?
That's a very good question, but you know, there's so many different groups. Christians are not a singular group by any means, right? There are all kinds, from Christian Scientists to Russian Orthodox to Pentecostal and Catholic and every kind of Protestant. So, and within each of those, there are many divisions. So it seems we'll have to become much more specific, you know.
But I could just, again, I'm going to be hesitant in commenting about America, especially. I come from a country in which every group, and I mean every subsection, sees itself as the persecuted minority. Like everybody, even those in power. And the story, and I love the way that story in the politics of fear is unbelievably powerful. So one of the ways to acquire power or to justify your abuse and abuse of it, or to get rid of checks and balances, is to tell the story of victimhood. And again, I know that firsthand. Like, I think there's a lot we could learn from each other's mistakes.
I mean, being new in America, I'm cautious about commenting against politics, but I can say some of the perceptions in America, to me, sounds like first world problems. Like, let me take you to Syria, see what persecution is in the dungeons of Bashar Assad, or in China, and I mean, of course, I mean, there might be more dominant groups in society culturally, and they might be too assertive, and that might be a problem. I understand that, but still, there is freedom in this country, and compared to many other parts of the world. And let's just keep it. And just one more thought. I mean, there was a question about, should we give more power to the religious people, and another one, should religions just disappear and humanity will be better? Now, your point, I totally agree, but Rabbi, there was this expectation in the early 19th century that a post-religious world will be a nice place. Then we've seen the Nazis, we've seen Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao and nationalism. And our ideologies. And actually they've been more destructive than maybe anything before. So I think the issue is not, should we give religious people too much power or not? Should we give anyone too much power or not? And I think the answer is no. That's why power should be constrained. And I think that's something we achieved to some extent through liberalism, and political liberalism. In the modern era, there was the idea that the right group should have power. No, nobody should have it. You should have constraints. You should have separation of powers, checks and balances. The president should not be too powerful. So I think those ideas of modern liberal democracy that is allowed by political pluralism, which, by the way, allowed Jews to enter into Europe as equal citizens, if I'm not wrong. The 18th century, Haskalah began thanks to that. So I think we need those kind of classical ideas of constraining power. It's that no group can assert its own way of life on others. And those groups could be religious, they could be secular groups, they could be progressive, they could be conservative. All of them can turn assertive, and that's why we need to constrain power everywhere.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Just to make one comment from the person who spoke about Princeton Seminary. When I first was thinking about these questions and was disturbed by the stories, I did go to Israel and I presented it at the Hebrew University, which was an interesting experience, this work. And then I presented it by invitation at Harvard, where I'd been a graduate student. And one of my professors said, "That's completely wrong. There's nothing anti-Semitic about Christianity. Two of them said that. I could tell you who they are, but maybe not. Christopher Stendhal understood, and he spoke up. But two others, one who had been in the Nazi army in his earlier life, said there's no anti-Semitism at all in Christianity, a German professor. And the other one who simply refused to accept any of this. So I don't think you would have heard it at the seminary, right? You wouldn't have heard this story.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to take our break for lunch. Round 3 will begin at 1:45. So there's a potato and salad bar out there to partake in, and you can bring it in here and use your tables. Anyway, thank you for being here. We'll see you after lunch.